The probate records from Greene County, Alabama, filed in October 1839, contain an inventory of personal property belonging to the estate of Nathaniel Crawford Harrington, deceased at age 47. Among the standard entries, furniture, livestock, agricultural equipment, and a 127 enslaved people valued at $80,400, appears an unusual notation that the court clerk initially marked for review before ultimately accepting without comment. The entry reads, 6 hunting dogs, specially trained, considerable value for specialized purposes, destroyed by order of executor. No valuation assigned. What those specialized purposes were, and why valuable animals were destroyed rather than sold or transferred, only becomes clear through examination of private correspondence, witness testimonies sealed by judicial order, and the horrified accounts preserved by enslaved people who witnessed events that autumn. This is the story of how Nathaniel Harrington's obsession with creating the perfect instruments of human pursuit culminated in tragedy that destroyed not just his own son, but exposed the moral corruption at the heart of Alabama's plantation economy. Before we continue with this account of how a wealthy planter's cruelty rebounded upon his own family in the most devastating way imaginable, I want to invite you to join our community dedicated to uncovering these difficult truths. Subscribe to Real Stories of Slavery and hit that notification bell so you never miss these essential chapters of American history. Please leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We love hearing where our audience connects from. Now let's examine what happened on the Harrington plantation in Greene County, Alabama, during the autumn of 1839. When a system of terror designed to maintain absolute control turned against its creator in ways he never anticipated. Nathaniel Crawford Harrington had built his fortune through ruthless efficiency and absolute conviction in his right to dominate both land and people. Born in 1792 to a moderately successful Virginia planter family, Nathaniel had recognized early that the expanding cotton territories of Alabama offered opportunities for ambitious men willing to be more aggressive than their competitors. He arrived in Greene County in 1818 with borrowed capital, purchased 800 acres at favorable prices from Creek families being forced westward, and immediately began the systematic construction of a cotton empire. By 1825, he owned 2,400 acres of prime Alabama Black Belt soil. By 1830, his holdings had expanded to 4,200 acres worked by 89 enslaved people. By 1835, he controlled 6,800 acres and 127 enslaved people, making him one of the wealthiest planters in the region. His annual cotton production exceeded 600 bales, generating revenues that allowed him to live in a manner befitting the aristocratic pretensions he had cultivated. His plantation house, completed in 1833, was a Greek Revival mansion with 16 rooms, imported furniture, and a wine cellar stocked with European vintages. He employed an overseer, 3 assistant overseers, and maintained the largest kennel of hunting dogs in the county. Nathaniel had married in 1820 to Catherine Morrison, daughter of a Charleston merchant family. The marriage produced 4 children: William, born 1821, Nathaniel Jr., born 1823, Elizabeth, born 1826, and Thomas, born 1828. Catherine died in 1834 from complications following a miscarriage, leaving Nathaniel to raise his children with help from his sister Margaret, who moved to the plantation to manage the household after Catherine's death. By all external measures, Nathaniel Harrington was a successful man, wealthy, respected by his peers, influential in county affairs, and secure in his social position. But beneath this prosperous surface existed a character defined by cruelty, paranoia, and an obsessive need for absolute control that would ultimately consume him and destroy his family. The dogs that would eventually tear apart Nathaniel's world were initially acquired for conventional hunting purposes. In 1828, Nathaniel purchased 3 bloodhounds from a breeder in South Carolina, paying premium prices for animals with documented lineage and proven tracking abilities. These dogs, named Caesar, Brutus, and Nero, were intended for hunting deer, bear, and other game on the extensive woodlands that bordered Nathaniel's cultivated fields. But sometime around 1831, Nathaniel began experimenting with a different application of the dog's tracking capabilities. The exact trigger for this shift isn't documented with certainty, but circumstantial evidence suggests it followed an incident in which two enslaved people successfully escaped from the Harrington plantation and remained at large for 3 weeks before being captured in Mississippi. The escape was financially costly. Both workers were valued at approximately $1,200 each, and the 3 weeks of their absence represented lost labor during critical planting season. More significantly, the successful escape undermined Nathaniel's authority and threatened his reputation among other planters. In the social hierarchy of Alabama's Black Belt, a planter's ability to maintain control over his enslaved workforce was a measure of his competence and masculinity. Escapes were embarrassing acknowledgments of inadequate mastery. Nathaniel responded to this humiliation by deciding that his hunting dogs could serve dual purposes. If bloodhounds could track deer and bear through miles of forest, they could certainly track humans. He began training Caesar, Brutus, and Nero specifically for this purpose, using methods that were both systematic and deliberately cruel. The training process, as later described by the plantation's overseer Samuel Hawkins in sealed testimony, involved creating associations between specific scents and rewards. Nathaniel would obtain clothing items worn by enslaved people and use these to create scent trails for the dogs to follow. Initially, the trails led to rewards, meat scraps, bones, positive reinforcement. But gradually, Nathaniel introduced a different element. He began ending the trails with live targets, enslaved people who were ordered to stand still while the dogs approached, learning to associate human scent with prey. This training escalated over months. By 1832, the dogs were being rewarded not just for tracking, but for aggressive confrontation. Nathaniel would have an enslaved person run a specific distance, then release the dogs to pursue. When the dogs caught their target, they were encouraged to bite, to hold, to demonstrate the aggressive behaviors that would make them effective instruments of terror. The enslaved people forced to participate in this training suffered both physical injuries from the dogs' attacks and the psychological trauma of being reduced to training equipment. By 1833, Caesar, Brutus, and Nero had been transformed from hunting animals into weapons specifically designed for human pursuit. But Nathaniel wasn't satisfied. He wanted a larger pack, more dogs, a more intimidating presence that would make the mere thought of escape seem futile. Between 1833 and 1836, he acquired 3 additional bloodhounds, Hannibal, Spartacus, and Augustus, and applied the same training methodology. By 1836, Nathaniel Harrington owned 6 dogs that had been systematically conditioned to track, pursue, and attack human beings. The mere sound of these dogs baying was enough to create terror throughout the enslaved community on the Harrington plantation and neighboring properties. The impact of Nathaniel's dogs on the enslaved community was devastating and multifaceted. On the most immediate level, the dogs eliminated escape as a viable option for most people. Previous to their deployment, enslaved people on the Harrington plantation had maintained the hope, however slim, that careful planning, favorable circumstances, and luck might enable successful flight to freedom. The dogs destroyed that hope. They could track a person through water, through dense forest, across distances that would take days to cover on foot. Once on a trail, they were relentless. And when they caught their target, they attacked with ferocity that left survivors with permanent scars, both physical and psychological. Between 1833 and 1839, the Harrington dogs were deployed at least 17 times to pursue people who had attempted to escape. Of those 17 pursuits, 16 resulted in the dogs catching their targets. The average time from release to capture was less than 8 hours. Only one person, a man named Joshua, successfully evaded the dogs by reaching the Tombigbee River and stealing a boat, putting enough water distance between himself and the pursuing pack that they lost his trail. Joshua's escape was the exception that proved the rule. Under normal circumstances, running from the Harrington plantation meant being caught by dogs trained to treat human beings as prey. But the dogs' impact extended far beyond their actual deployments. Their mere presence created constant psychological pressure. Enslaved people on the Harrington plantation lived with the knowledge that those dogs were always there, always ready, always capable of being unleashed at any moment. This knowledge functioned as a form of continuous terrorism, making every moment potentially dangerous, making escape seem impossible, reinforcing the absolute power that Nathaniel wielded over the people he claimed to own. Other planters in Greene County noticed the effectiveness of Nathaniel's dogs and began asking to borrow them for their own purposes. Nathaniel accommodated these requests selectively, creating a network of obligation and fear that extended across multiple plantations. The Harrington dogs became notorious throughout the region, their reputation spreading through both the planter community, where they were admired as effective instruments of control, and the enslaved community, where they were feared as symbols of white power's capacity for violence. Nathaniel himself took visible pride in his dogs. He would bring them to social gatherings, demonstrate their tracking abilities, discuss their training with other planters. He viewed them as extensions of his own power and intelligence, proof of his superior ability to maintain order and discipline. His sons, particularly William and Nathaniel Jr., were raised observing their father's relationship with the dogs and learning to view them as normal, even admirable tools for maintaining the plantation system. This normalization of weaponized animals, this casual acceptance of dogs trained to attack human beings, became part of the Harrington family culture in ways that would have devastating consequences. William Harrington, Nathaniel's eldest son, was 18 years old in 1839 and had been groomed since childhood to eventually inherit and manage the plantation. He had been educated by private tutors, had learned the economics of cotton production, had observed his father's management techniques, and had gradually been given increasing responsibilities in plantation operations. By 1839, William was serving as assistant to the overseer, managing field operations, maintaining discipline among the enslaved workforce, and demonstrating the competence that would be necessary when he eventually assumed full ownership. William's personality reflected both his father's influence and certain differences that created tension between them. Like Nathaniel, William believed absolutely in his right to own other human beings, accepted the racial hierarchies that justified slavery, and viewed enslaved people as property to be managed efficiently. But unlike his father, William lacked the sadistic streak that characterized Nathaniel's approach to control. William's cruelty was bureaucratic rather than personal. He would order punishments when he deemed them necessary for maintaining productivity. But he didn't take visible pleasure in inflicting pain the way his father did. This difference manifested in William's attitude toward the dogs. He recognized their utility as instruments of control and had participated in their deployment on several occasions. But he also maintained a slight distance from them, treating them as tools rather than as extensions of his own power. William didn't share his father's pride in the dogs' ferocity or his enjoyment of demonstrating their capabilities. This subtle difference would prove significant in the events that followed. In August 1839, William became involved in a romantic relationship that his father viewed as inappropriate. The young woman, Sarah Blackwell, was the daughter of a neighboring planter whose financial position had deteriorated significantly over recent years. Her father, Robert Blackwell, had lost portions of his property to creditors and was widely viewed as a declining force in local society. Nathaniel strongly opposed any connection between his son and the Blackwell family, viewing it as a social step backward that would diminish the Harrington family's standing. William disagreed with his father's assessment. He genuinely cared for Sarah, believed that the Blackwell family's temporary financial difficulties shouldn't matter more than personal affection, and resented his father's interference in his romantic life. By September 1839, this disagreement had escalated into the most serious conflict that had yet occurred between father and son. Nathaniel forbade William from seeing Sarah and ordered him to focus entirely on plantation business. William initially complied publicly while continuing to meet Sarah secretly. When Nathaniel discovered this deception in late September, he was enraged. The confrontation that followed revealed the depth of Nathaniel's need for absolute control and his inability to accept any challenge to his authority, even from his own son. The specific details of the confrontation between Nathaniel and William on September 28, 1839, were later reconstructed through testimony from multiple witnesses, including the overseer Samuel Hawkins, Nathaniel's sister Margaret, and several enslaved people who were present in proximity to the argument. The confrontation began in Nathaniel's study around 2 in the afternoon. William had returned from what Nathaniel suspected was another secret meeting with Sarah Blackwell. Nathaniel demanded to know where William had been. William initially tried to deflect the question, claiming he had been inspecting boundary fences on the northern property line. Nathaniel didn't believe this explanation and pressed harder. The argument escalated quickly. Nathaniel accused William of disobedience, of dishonoring the family, of demonstrating the kind of weak character that would make him unfit to eventually inherit the plantation. William responded with his own accusations that Nathaniel was a tyrant, that his obsessive need for control had poisoned their family relationships, that his cruelty to enslaved people was excessive even by the standards of other planters in the region. This last accusation was particularly inflammatory. William was essentially suggesting that his father's behavior went beyond the normal brutality of slavery into something more pathological. He specifically mentioned the dogs, calling them symbols of Nathaniel's sadism rather than practical tools for plantation management. For Nathaniel, this criticism cut to the core of his self-image. He viewed his dogs not as evidence of cruelty, but as proof of his superior ability to maintain order. Having his son challenge this understanding was intolerable. The argument became physical. According to witness accounts, Nathaniel struck William across the face. William, 18 years old and physically strong from years of plantation work, instinctively pushed his father back. Nathaniel stumbled, caught himself, and for a moment, the two men stood facing each other in a tableau that captured the generational conflict and the violence that saturated plantation culture. Then Nathaniel ordered William out of his sight, telling him to leave the plantation house and not return until he was prepared to apologize and submit completely to his father's authority. William left, furious and humiliated, heading toward the overseer's cabin where he sometimes stayed when working late on plantation business. This was approximately 3:30 in the afternoon on September 28, 1839. What happened next would transform a family argument into a tragedy that exposed the moral bankruptcy of the entire system Nathaniel had built. Nathaniel spent the hours after the confrontation in his study, drinking whiskey and brooding over his son's disobedience. By all accounts, he became increasingly angry rather than calmer, working himself into a state of rage that combined genuine hurt over William's rebellion with fury at being challenged. Nathaniel's sister Margaret attempted to speak with him around 5 in the evening, suggesting that perhaps he was being too harsh, that William was 18 and naturally wanted some independence in choosing a romantic partner. Nathaniel rejected this advice completely, viewing it as further evidence that people around him didn't understand the necessity of absolute authority. By 6 in the evening, Nathaniel had made a decision that would define the remainder of his life and destroy his family. He would teach William a lesson about obedience, about the consequences of defying authority, about the nature of power on the Harrington plantation. He would use the same methods he had always used when someone under his control stepped out of line. He would deploy the dogs. The overseer, Samuel Hawkins, later testified that around 6:30 that evening, Nathaniel summoned him to the kennels and gave specific instructions. He told Hawkins that William had left the plantation house earlier without permission and that Nathaniel wanted him found and brought back immediately. Hawkins was to take the dogs, all 6 of them, and use them to track William's trail from the house to wherever he had gone. When the dogs found William, Hawkins was to allow them to bring him down and hold him until Hawkins could secure him with ropes. Hawkins would then bring William back to the plantation house in restraints, where Nathaniel would administer appropriate punishment for disobedience. Hawkins later claimed he had felt uneasy about these instructions. He knew William hadn't actually fled the plantation, but had simply gone to the overseer's cabin. He knew that William was the plantation owner's son, not an escaping enslaved person. He suspected that Nathaniel's judgment was impaired by alcohol and anger. But Hawkins also knew that his own position depended entirely on following Nathaniel's orders without question. Any hesitation, any suggestion that the orders were inappropriate, would cost him his employment and his reputation. So he complied. At approximately 7 in the evening on September 28, 1839, Samuel Hawkins released 6 bloodhounds trained specifically to pursue and attack human beings, giving them William Harrington's scent from a shirt Nathaniel provided, and set them on the trail leading from the main house toward the overseer's cabin. William Harrington had spent the hours since the confrontation in the overseer's cabin, trying to calm his anger and decide what to do next. He was torn between his love for his father, his resentment of his father's controlling behavior, his affection for Sarah Blackwell, and his awareness that defying his father further could cost him his inheritance and future. By early evening, he had decided to return to the main house the next morning, attempt a more rational conversation, and try to find some compromise that would allow him to maintain a relationship with Sarah while not completely alienating his father. This decision would come too late. At approximately 7:15 in the evening, William heard sounds that initially confused him, dogs baying in the distance, moving rapidly in his direction. His first thought was that his father had decided to go hunting at an unusual hour, though evening wasn't typical time for such activity. Then the sounds grew closer and more aggressive, and William began to understand something was wrong. He stepped out of the overseer's cabin to investigate. What he saw would have been his last clear memory before the attack: 6 large bloodhounds. The same dogs he had grown up around, the same animals he had seen deployed dozens of times against escaping enslaved people, running directly toward him with the focused intensity they showed when pursuing targets. William's initial reaction, according to witnesses who observed from distance, was confusion rather than fear. These were his father's dogs. He had been around them his entire life. He had fed them, had participated in their training, had watched them work. They knew him. They had never shown aggression toward him. Surely they would recognize him and stop. This assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. The dogs had been trained over years to associate specific behaviors with prey: running, fleeing, showing fear. They had been conditioned to attack people who displayed these characteristics. And critically, they had been released with instructions to pursue a human scent trail, given every indication through Hawkins's commands and excitement that this was a legitimate hunt, a proper deployment of their specialized training. When William saw the dogs approaching and instinctively moved backward toward the cabin door, he triggered the exact prey responses the dogs had been conditioned to attack. The pack reached William in seconds. What followed was exactly what happened when these dogs caught any other target they had been set upon. They attacked with the ferocity and technique they had been trained to employ. Caesar, the lead dog and most aggressive of the pack, reached William first and leaped at him, powerful jaws closing on William's left forearm as he raised it defensively. The force of the impact knocked William backward. Before he could recover, Brutus and Nero had reached him, attacking his legs and trying to bring him down. William screamed for help, tried to fight off the dogs, attempted to issue commands that might make them stop. But the dogs were operating on instinct and training, responding to the scent they had been given, the chase they had been released to complete, and the aggressive stimuli that William's defensive movements provided. Within 30 seconds of initial contact, William was on the ground with 6 dogs attacking him simultaneously. Samuel Hawkins reached the scene approximately 1 minute after the dogs had made contact with William. What he found was carnage that would haunt him for the rest of his life. William was on the ground, covered in blood, trying desperately to protect his throat and face, while 6 dogs tore at his arms, legs, and torso. Hawkins immediately understood the catastrophic error that had occurred and began trying to call off the dogs. But the animals were in full attack mode, operating on the training and instincts that had been deliberately cultivated in them. Calling them off required physical intervention. Hawkins waded into the pack with a heavy stick, striking at the dogs, trying to drive them away from William. The dogs resisted. They had been trained to hold their targets until given specific release commands, and Hawkins's efforts to beat them away were interpreted as interference to be overcome. It took nearly 2 minutes of sustained physical combat with the animals before Hawkins succeeded in separating them from William. By that time, other people had arrived, drawn by William's screams and the sounds of the attack. 3 enslaved men who had been working in nearby fields reached the scene and helped Hawkins secure the dogs. Nathaniel's sister, Margaret, arrived and saw her nephew lying in a pool of blood with injuries that were immediately recognizable as life-threatening. And Nathaniel himself arrived, having been drawn from the main house by the commotion, expecting to find his son properly chastened by being tracked and intimidated by the dogs, not comprehending what his orders had actually set in motion. The scene that confronted Nathaniel destroyed his world in an instant. His eldest son, his heir, the young man he had been grooming for years to continue the Harrington family legacy, was lying on the ground with massive trauma from dog attacks. Both of William's arms had been severely mauled, with deep lacerations and probable broken bones. His left leg had injuries that exposed muscle and possibly bone. He had defensive wounds on his hands and face where he had tried to protect himself. Most critically, he had a wound on his throat, where one of the dogs had managed to achieve the kind of grip that was usually fatal when they caught escaping enslaved people. Blood was pooling beneath him at a rate that indicated major arterial damage. Margaret immediately began trying to provide first aid, pressing cloth against the worst bleeding, calling for water and bandages, organizing the enslaved people who had gathered to assist. But even as she worked, she understood that William's injuries were likely beyond what their rural Alabama plantation could treat effectively. The nearest doctor was in Utah, 8 miles away. It would take at least an hour to send for him and have him arrive. William might not survive that long. Nathaniel stood frozen, unable to process what had happened. He had ordered the dogs released, expecting them to track William, perhaps intimidate him, maybe knock him down and hold him until Hawkins arrived. He had never intended for them to attack with the full ferocity they employed against escaping enslaved people. But the dogs couldn't distinguish between targets. They had been trained to attack people who ran or resisted. William, confronted by 6 large aggressive animals, had done exactly what any person would do. He had tried to defend himself and escape. And the dogs had responded exactly as they had been trained to respond. Nathaniel had created instruments of terror so effective that they turned against his own son without hesitation. William Harrington died at approximately 9:30 in the evening on September 28, 1839, roughly 2 hours after being attacked by his father's dogs. A doctor arrived from Utah around 10 that evening, but by then, There was nothing to be done except confirm death and examine the body to document the cause. The doctor's report, filed with the county coroner, listed cause of death as catastrophic blood loss from multiple traumatic injuries consistent with animal attack. The report noted more than 40 separate wounds on William's body, including the fatal throat injury that had severed his carotid artery. The doctor also noted in his private correspondence, later obtained by researchers, that he had never seen injuries of this severity on a white person before, though he had treated several enslaved people who had survived dog attacks with similar but less extensive trauma. The immediate aftermath of William's death created a crisis that threatened to expose the entire truth of what had happened. Multiple witnesses had observed the attack, including enslaved people who understood exactly what had occurred and why. The overseer, Samuel Hawkins, knew that he had followed Nathaniel's explicit orders in deploying the dogs. Margaret Harrington had arrived in time to see William dying from injuries inflicted by animals her brother had deliberately trained for exactly this purpose. The two younger Harrington sons, Nathaniel Jr. and Thomas, learned what had happened and understood the implications. All of these people possessed knowledge that, if publicly acknowledged, would destroy Nathaniel Harrington's reputation, social position, and possibly his freedom. The next 24 hours involved frantic efforts to construct a narrative that would protect the family from the full consequences of what had occurred. Nathaniel, emerging from his initial shock, began asserting a version of events that removed his own culpability. He claimed that William had been walking near the kennels when the dogs had somehow escaped their restraints and attacked him spontaneously. There had been no deliberate release, no tracking, no orders given to pursue anyone. It had been a tragic accident, an equipment failure, an unforeseeable catastrophe that could have happened to anyone who kept hunting dogs. Samuel Hawkins was instructed to support this narrative and did so, understanding that his future employment and possibly his life depended on protecting Nathaniel. Margaret, devastated by her nephew's death but also dependent on her brother for support, reluctantly agreed to avoid discussing the actual circumstances. The enslaved people who had witnessed events were in no position to challenge the official story. Their testimony wouldn't be accepted in any legal proceeding, and speaking the truth would likely result in severe punishment. Only one person refused to participate in the cover-up. Nathaniel Jr., 15 years old and shattered by his older brother's death, insisted on telling the truth about what had happened. He had not witnessed the attack directly, but had learned the actual sequence of events from conversations he overheard and from his own knowledge of how his father deployed the dogs. He understood that William's death was not an accident, but the direct result of Nathaniel's deliberate decision to set trained attack dogs on his own son, and he wanted his father held accountable. The conflict between Nathaniel and his second son created fractures in the family that would never heal. Nathaniel attempted to enforce silence through his usual methods: assertion of absolute parental authority, threats of disinheritance, and when those failed, physical intimidation. But Nathaniel Jr. possessed a stubbornness and moral clarity that his father hadn't anticipated. He insisted that the truth needed to be acknowledged, that William deserved justice, that the family couldn't simply pretend a tragedy had been a random accident when it had actually been the direct result of his father's cruelty. By October 1st, 1839, 3 days after William's death, the family was in open crisis. Nathaniel Jr. had stated his intention to provide truthful testimony to any legal authorities who investigated the circumstances. This threat forced Nathaniel to confront the possibility of actual criminal consequences for his actions. Alabama law in 1839 didn't criminalize the training of dogs to attack enslaved people. Such training was considered a legitimate exercise of property rights. But deploying those same dogs against a white person, even unintentionally, was a different matter. and deploying them against one's own son, even if the intent had been intimidation rather than death, could be prosecuted as negligent homicide or even manslaughter. The formal legal investigation that began on October 2, 1839, was compromised from its inception by social and political pressures that favored protecting Nathaniel. The county sheriff, James Morrison, was a business associate of Nathaniel's and had borrowed money from him on several occasions. The county coroner, Dr. Edward Hayes, socialized with Nathaniel and belonged to the same political faction. The magistrate who would oversee any legal proceedings, Judge Samuel Randolph, owned his own plantation and had previously expressed admiration for Nathaniel's methods of maintaining slave discipline, including the training of dogs. All of these men had professional, financial, or social reasons to avoid pursuing charges that would destroy a prominent planter. But they also faced pressure from Nathaniel Jr., his insistence on truth, and from community members who were disturbed by what had happened. The compromise that emerged was a limited investigation that acknowledged some problematic elements of the case while avoiding any finding that would result in criminal charges. The official inquiry heard testimony from Samuel Hawkins, who carefully described events in ways that minimized Nathaniel's culpability. He acknowledged that he had deployed the dogs on Nathaniel's orders, but claimed he had understood those orders to mean tracking William's location, not attacking him. He testified that the dogs had behaved unpredictably and contrary to their training when they actually attacked. This testimony was deliberately misleading. The dogs had behaved exactly according to their training, but it provided legal cover for both Hawkins and Nathaniel. Margaret Harrington testified that she had not witnessed the attack itself, and could only speak to finding William already injured. She carefully avoided discussing what Nathaniel had told her about deploying the dogs or the conversations she had overheard in the immediate aftermath. Nathaniel Jr. was not permitted to testify formally because of his age. At 15, he was below the threshold for providing legal testimony in Alabama courts. This convenient legal barrier prevented the most damaging witness from speaking officially, though his allegations circulated informally and created social pressure on the investigation. Several enslaved people were questioned, but their testimony was not recorded officially because Alabama law prohibited enslaved people from testifying against white people in most circumstances. The investigators did note in private memoranda that the enslaved witnesses' accounts were consistent with a deliberate deployment of the dogs on Nathaniel's orders, but this information couldn't be used in any formal proceeding. The investigation concluded on October 15, 1839, with findings that acknowledged irregularities but stopped short of criminal charges. The official report stated that William Harrington had died from injuries sustained when hunting dogs attacked him under circumstances that suggested inadequate restraint and supervision of dangerous animals. The report noted that Nathaniel Harrington bore responsibility for maintaining proper control of his dogs and had failed in this duty. As consequence, the report recommended civil penalties, a fine of $500 for maintaining dangerous animals without adequate security, and an order requiring the immediate destruction of all dogs involved in the attack. But there would be no criminal prosecution, no manslaughter charges, no acknowledgement that Nathaniel had deliberately set attack dogs on his own son. The destruction of the 6 bloodhounds occurred on October 18, 1839, under supervision of the county sheriff. Nathaniel was required to be present, witnessing the elimination of animals he had spent years training and had taken pride in as symbols of his power. Each dog was shot individually, their bodies burned, their presence erased from the Harrington plantation. For Nathaniel, this destruction represented not just the loss of valuable property, but the dismantling of a central element of his identity. The dogs had been extensions of his authority, proof of his superior ability to maintain control. Their elimination was a form of symbolic castration that Nathaniel experienced as personal defeat. But the psychological damage to Nathaniel paled compared to the broader family disintegration that followed William's death. Nathaniel Jr. never forgave his father and never accepted the official narrative that minimized Nathaniel's responsibility. The relationship between father and second son was permanently destroyed. Elizabeth Harrington, 13 years old at the time of her brother's death, withdrew emotionally from both parents, becoming quiet and depressed. Thomas, the youngest son at 11, was simply confused and traumatized by watching his family destroy itself. Margaret Harrington, caught between loyalty to her brother and horror at what he had done, suffered a nervous breakdown in November 1839 and had to be sent to relatives in Virginia for extended recovery. The plantation itself began to deteriorate as Nathaniel lost the focus and energy that had previously driven his business success. Cotton production declined in 1840 and 1841. Nathaniel began drinking heavily, spending days in his study rather than managing operations. The enslaved people on the plantation, already traumatized by years of living under constant threat from the dogs, now worked under an owner who was both grief-stricken and alcoholic, making him even more unpredictable and dangerous than before. Several attempted escapes occurred in late 1839 and throughout 1840, emboldened by the absence of the dogs that had previously made flight seem impossible. Without the dogs to pursue escapees, Nathaniel had to rely on conventional methods, rewards for capture, patrols, collaboration with neighboring planters. These methods were less effective, and several people successfully reached freedom in the North. Each successful escape represented not just financial loss, but further evidence of Nathaniel's declining control and diminishing authority. By early 1841, Nathaniel Harrington was a broken man presiding over a disintegrating enterprise. His eldest son was dead. His second son refused to speak to him. His daughter and youngest son were emotionally damaged. His sister had abandoned the plantation. His formerly efficient business operations were deteriorating. His reputation in the community, while technically intact due to the whitewashed investigation, was quietly damaged by everyone who knew what had actually happened. The tragedy that had been set in motion by his decision to deploy attack dogs against his own son had consumed everything he had built. The final crisis came in April 1841 when Nathaniel Jr., now 17, made arrangements to leave the plantation permanently. He had been corresponding secretly with relatives in Virginia and had secured their agreement to take him in and provide support while he pursued education. His departure represented the last severing of family connections and the end of Nathaniel's dream of building a generational plantation empire. The Harrington sons who should have continued the family legacy were dead or estranged. The plantation that should have been passed down intact would have to be sold or divided. Everything that Nathaniel had worked for across 23 years of ruthless accumulation had been destroyed by a single decision to treat his own son with the same cruelty he had always employed against enslaved people. Nathaniel Crawford Harrington died on September 15, 1841, almost exactly 2 years after his son William's death. The official cause was listed as liver failure complicated by chronic alcoholism, though some who knew him believed he had essentially drunk himself to death from grief and guilt. He was 47 years old, the same age his father had been when he died. The probate of Nathaniel's estate revealed the extent of his business decline over the final 2 years of his life. The plantation that had been valued at approximately $110,000 in 1839 was worth less than $75,000 by 1841. Debts had accumulated to nearly $28,000, largely from operational losses and Nathaniel's failure to manage the property effectively. The 127 enslaved people who had been part of the estate in 1839 numbered only 114 by 1841, with the difference representing both successful escapes and sales to cover operating expenses. The Greek revival mansion that had symbolized Nathaniel's success was showing signs of neglect and deferred maintenance. The remaining family, Nathaniel Jr., Elizabeth and Thomas, inherited portions of an estate that was substantially diminished from its peak value. Nathaniel Jr. received his portion and used it to permanently relocate to Virginia, never returning to Alabama. Elizabeth married in 1844 to a merchant from Mobile, leaving the plantation and its traumatic associations behind. Thomas, as the youngest heir and the only son who maintained any connection to the property, eventually sold the plantation in 1848 rather than attempting to operate it himself. The scattered proceeds of this sale were divided among the siblings, none of whom ever lived on the property again. The enslaved people who had survived years under Nathaniel's brutal control were sold at estate liquidation to various buyers, their families separated, their lives disrupted once again by the economic calculations of a system that treated them as disposable property. For them, Nathaniel's death represented not freedom, but merely a change in oppressors, a shift from one master to another with no guarantee that the new situations would be better than what they had endured. The physical remains of the Harrington plantation deteriorated across the following decades. The mansion burned in 1867, whether from accident or arson was never determined. The fields were eventually absorbed into other properties or abandoned. By 1900, almost nothing remained to mark where one of Greene County's wealthiest planters had built his empire and destroyed his family. But the story survived through multiple channels, preserved in different forms by different communities with different stakes in remembering what had happened. The white community's memory of the Harrington tragedy was characterized by discomfort, euphemism, and eventual suppression. Among the planter class in Greene County, Nathaniel's story was initially discussed in private conversations as a cautionary tale about the dangers of excessive reliance on aggressive slave control methods. Some planters saw William's death as evidence that training dogs specifically to attack humans was imprudent, regardless of how effective such training might be for preventing escapes. Others viewed the tragedy as simply bad luck, a well-intentioned disciplinary action that had unfortunate consequences due to circumstances no one could have predicted. Very few were willing to acknowledge the deeper truth, that the system of slavery itself, with its requirement of constant terror and violence to maintain control, inevitably created situations where that terror and violence rebounded against the enslavers themselves. This discomfort with confronting systematic brutality led to gradual erasure of the story from public discourse. By the 1850s, respectable society in Greene County had largely stopped discussing the Harrington tragedy. When Nathaniel's name came up, it was usually in connection with his former economic success rather than his moral failures. The specific circumstances of William's death were obscured behind vague references to a hunting accident or animal attack, with no mention of the deliberate training that had made the attack possible or Nathaniel's role in deploying the dogs against his own son. After the Civil War, as white Southerners constructed narratives about plantation life that minimized slavery's brutality and romanticized the antebellum period, the Harrington story became even more problematic. It contradicted claims that slaveholders were benevolent paternalists who cared for enslaved people like family members. It exposed the violence and cruelty that were essential to maintaining the system. It revealed that slaveholders' obsession with absolute control could be pathological and self-destructive. For these reasons, the story was actively suppressed in official histories and public commemorations of Alabama's plantation era. The descendants of the Harrington family participated in this suppression, preferring to forget their ancestors' actions rather than grapple with their implications. By the early 20th century, most white residents of Greene County had no knowledge of what had happened on the Harrington plantation in 1839, and those who did have family memories of the events avoided discussing them publicly. In contrast to white silence and suppression, the African American community's preservation of the Harrington story was active, detailed, and purposeful. The enslaved people who had lived under Nathaniel's terror, who had witnessed William's attack, and who had survived the brutality of a system that trained dogs to hunt human beings, passed the story down through generations as both historical record and moral lesson. In the oral traditions maintained by descendants of enslaved people from the Harrington plantation and surrounding properties, the story of William's death served multiple purposes. It documented the reality of slavery's violence in ways that contradicted romanticized lost cause narratives. It demonstrated that the system's brutality was not incidental, but essential, not exceptional, but normalized. And significantly, it showed that the violence slaveholders directed at enslaved people could turn against themselves, that the instruments of terror they created were not fully controllable, that the moral corruption at slavery's heart ultimately poisoned everyone it touched. The African American versions of the story preserved details that white accounts suppressed: the specific training methods Nathaniel used with the dogs, the names of enslaved people who had been attacked by the animals before William's death, the testimony that enslaved witnesses wanted to give but were legally prohibited from providing, and the broader context of constant fear and violence that defined life under Nathaniel's control. These preserved narratives also included information about the enslaved people who successfully escaped from the Harrington plantation after the dogs were destroyed, carrying forward the names and, in some cases, the ultimate destinations of people who achieved freedom that had previously seemed impossible. In community gatherings, churches, and family storytelling sessions, the Harrington tragedy was recounted as a reminder that resistance was possible, that oppressive systems contained their own contradictions, and that the violence white people inflicted on black communities could sometimes rebound against its perpetrators in ways that revealed the system's fundamental instability. The story was also preserved in written form by several formerly enslaved people who gained literacy after the Civil War and documented their experiences or the experiences of people they had known. At least 3 published slave narratives from Alabama make reference to Nathaniel Harrington's dogs, though usually without naming him directly, describing the terror these animals created and the relief people felt when they were finally destroyed. One narrative, published in 1889 by a man who identified himself only as formerly enslaved in Greene County, Alabama, includes a detailed account of William's death and explicitly states that it resulted from Nathaniel deliberately setting attack dogs on his son after a family argument. This account corroborates the version of events that Nathaniel Jr. had tried to make public during the 1839 investigation, but had been prevented from testifying about formally. The long-term impact of the Harrington tragedy on Alabama's plantation system was complex and contradictory. On one level, William's death did lead some planters to reconsider the specific practice of training dogs specifically for attacking human beings. Several plantation owners in Greene County and surrounding areas who had been impressed by Nathaniel's dogs decided not to replicate his methods after seeing where they ultimately led. This represented a small mitigation of one particularly brutal technique within the broader system of slavery's violence. But on another level, the whitewashed investigation and the lack of serious legal consequences for Nathaniel reinforced the fundamental impunity that white slaveholders enjoyed. The message sent by the investigation's outcome was clear. Even when a planter's cruelty literally killed his own son, the legal system would find ways to avoid holding him accountable in any meaningful sense. This reinforced enslaved people's understanding that they could expect no justice from official institutions, that the violence directed against them would never be seriously challenged by authorities, and that survival depended entirely on their own strategies of resistance and mutual support rather than on any protection from law or society. The specific prohibition against maintaining dangerous animals that the investigation recommended became part of Greene County's legal code, but was enforced inconsistently and primarily as a mechanism for resolving disputes between white property owners rather than as protection for enslaved people. Planters continued to use dogs for tracking and intimidation, though perhaps with slightly more discretion about training methods and deployment. The essential terroristic function of such animals in maintaining slavery remained intact, just with marginally increased attention to avoiding accidents that might harm white people. In the broader sweep of Alabama's history, the Harrington tragedy was a minor incident that barely registered in official records and public consciousness. It didn't change the fundamental dynamics of slavery in the state, didn't lead to reforms or increased protections for enslaved people, and didn't alter the trajectory toward the Civil War that would eventually destroy the entire system. It was simply one among thousands of incidents of brutality, violence, and moral corruption that characterized slavery throughout its existence. But for the individuals directly affected, William, who died, Nathaniel Jr., Elizabeth and Thomas, who survived with permanent trauma, the enslaved people who had lived under Nathaniel's terror, and the communities who remembered the story, the tragedy had profound and lasting significance. The physical evidence of what happened on the Harrington plantation in September 1839 has long since disappeared. The plantation house is gone, burned to ashes. The kennels where Nathaniel kept his dogs have crumbled into dust. The field where William was attacked has been plowed and replanted hundreds of times, erasing any trace of the blood that soaked into Alabama soil that evening. Even the graves are questionable. William was buried in what was supposed to be a family cemetery on the plantation grounds, but the exact location has been lost and modern development has covered any remaining markers. But the story persists, because it matters. It matters as documentation of how slavery brutalized everyone it touched, not just the enslaved, but also the enslavers who allowed the system's logic of domination and violence to corrupt their humanity so thoroughly that they would treat their own children with the same cruelty they directed at human beings they claimed as property. It matters as evidence of how systems of oppression create monsters, not through some inherent evil in individuals, but through the systematic normalization of violence and the elimination of moral constraints that would exist in healthier societies. Nathaniel Harrington was not an aberration or an exception. He was a logical product of a system that required brutal violence to function, that encouraged white men to exercise absolute power over other human beings, and that provided no meaningful limitations on how that power could be exercised. It matters as a reminder that the violence slavery required could not be perfectly controlled or directed only at its intended targets. The attack dogs that Nathaniel trained to terrorize enslaved people into submission were weapons that could, and eventually did, turn against their owner's own family. This was not poetic justice in any satisfying sense. William's death didn't free any enslaved people or undermine the system in any meaningful way. But it did reveal a truth that apologists for slavery preferred to ignore. Violence and terror are inherently unstable forces that create risks for everyone in proximity to them, including those who believe they can wield such forces with impunity. It matters as documentation of resistance and survival by enslaved people who preserved the true story, despite attempts by white authorities and families to suppress it. The African American community's maintenance of accurate historical memory about events like the Harrington tragedy served critical functions, honoring those who suffered, countering false narratives about slavery, and maintaining knowledge of how the system actually operated, rather than how its defenders claimed it operated. This preservation of truth in the face of attempted historical erasure is itself a form of resistance that continues to matter in contemporary struggles over historical memory and racial justice. And finally, it matters because the fundamental dynamics that created the Harrington tragedy, systems of domination backed by violence, dehumanization of targeted groups, training of instruments of terror, and the corruption of people who exercise power without meaningful constraints, did not end with slavery's abolition. Understanding how these dynamics operated in the past provides insight into how they continue to operate in present circumstances, in different forms, but with similar underlying patterns. The story of a wealthy planter who trained dogs to hunt human beings and saw those dogs turn on his own son is not just historical curiosity, but a warning about what happens when societies organize themselves around oppression and violence. The question that haunts the Harrington tragedy is whether Nathaniel understood, in his final 2 years of decline and alcoholism, what he had actually done and what it meant. Did he grasp that William's death was not a random accident, but the direct consequence of his own choices and values? Did he recognize that the same capacity for cruelty that had made him successful as a planter had ultimately destroyed his family? Did he see any connection between his treatment of enslaved people and the tragedy that befell his own son? The evidence is ambiguous. Nathaniel never made any public statement acknowledging responsibility beyond what the limited investigation forced him to accept. He never apologized to Nathaniel Jr. or attempted reconciliation with his surviving children. He never freed any enslaved people or renounced the system that had given him wealth and power. His descent into alcoholism suggests guilt and despair, but whether this represented genuine moral reckoning or simply grief over the loss of his son and his dreams of generational legacy is impossible to determine from the historical record. What is clear is that Nathaniel never faced justice in any meaningful sense. He paid a fine. He was forced to destroy his dogs. He suffered social embarrassment and loss of reputation among people who knew what had actually happened. But he was never criminally prosecuted, never imprisoned, never held publicly accountable in ways that would have acknowledged the full scope of his actions. The enslaved people who had suffered under his brutality for years received no compensation, no apology, no recognition. The family members who had been traumatized by William's death and its aftermath received no support or counseling beyond what they could provide each other. The system that had enabled and encouraged Nathaniel's cruelty continued functioning without meaningful reform. In this sense, the Harrington tragedy was emblematic of how slavery operated more broadly. Endemic violence and brutality occasionally produced dramatic incidents that troubled even defenders of the system. But these incidents almost never led to accountability or systematic change. They were absorbed, explained away, suppressed, and ultimately forgotten by the white community while being remembered and passed down as warnings and documentation by the black community that experienced slavery's violence most directly. The legacy of Nathaniel Crawford Harrington is ultimately the legacy of slavery itself. A story of how the pursuit of wealth and power through oppression and violence corrupted human relationships, destroyed families, created instruments of terror that turned against their creators, and left wounds that persisted for generations. His story deserves to be remembered not because he was exceptional, but because he was typical. Not because his tragedy was unique, but because it revealed patterns that characterized the entire system, not to excuse or forgive, but to document and understand how such horrors become normalized and how they ultimately consume everyone involved. The 6 bloodhounds that died on October 18, 1839, were not the real monsters of this story. They were animals trained by a human being to perform tasks that served a brutal system. The real monsters were the people who created and maintained that system, who defended it as natural and proper, who profited from it while inflicting immeasurable suffering, and who occasionally paid a fraction of the price their victims paid constantly. Nathaniel Harrington trained his dogs to hunt human beings, and one day those dogs attacked his own son. This is historical fact. But the deeper truth is that slavery trained human beings to treat each other with cruelty that destroyed the humanity of both oppressed and oppressor, and everyone paid the price for that corruption in different ways and different measures. That truth matters as much now as it did in 1839, and that is why stories like the Harrington tragedy must be preserved, remembered, and examined for the lessons they contain about power, violence, justice, and the long shadows that history casts across generations.